Hey, I'm Chris from Make Everything, and today I'm going to show you the bed/couch I designed for my Sprinter van. It uses one sheet of plywood and an interlocking design that you can cut with a jigsaw and a circular saw. Converts from a couch to a bed in about 2 seconds. Check it out. So this is my 2019 Sprinter crew van, and I'm going to be doing some weekend trips in this with my girlfriend, and I want to be able to have a nice sized bed that's comfortable but can also get stowed out of the way when we need room inside the van, change and get stuff together. Now this is a 144 wheelbase, so it's a relatively small Sprinter van in comparison to some of the bigger ones, and I really wanted to make something that was compact. I also didn't want to go too crazy and build something with hinges and legs that folded out. I wanted something really simple. So this design utilizes one sheet of plywood. It's actually not even a full sheet. And the way you cut the kerfs with your circular saw and jigsaw, there's actually enough of a tolerance in there that this thing can interlock with itself. And I used a couple of pieces of 1x1 steel, which you can easily purchase from like Home Depot, and I tied it all together with some angle iron mounted to the sides of the van itself. Really simple project, and you can see now how the mechanism works, and then we'll get into how I built it. So you can see while the bed is up in couch mode, the design of the leaves here. So as I flip the mattress up, you can see it even better. So you've got fingers, and then we've got self-tapping screws that go down into some 1x1 steel. Now 1x1 steel is easily available and easy to purchase at Home Depot, so you can go and get it. You don't need to go to a steel supplier. And these self-tapping screws go right in there, so there's really no complicated metal work that you have to do for this project. This is all from one sheet, so it all perfectly registers. You don't have to worry about making tenons that are going to fit right in another mating material. You're just going to cut this whole thing out in one section, and if one of these tenons is a little smaller than the other, it doesn't matter because it's going to fit between the other pieces and it's going to have to register. Now I added these little pieces on the side so there wouldn't be a gap on the sides when you're trying to rest, but it's really nice to have a queen size mattress in here, plenty of room to move around, and it really utilizes all the space that it could. Now this is a tri-fold futon that I purchased on Amazon. I think it was a little bit under $200. I'll throw links to the mattress and the mattress topper that I used in the description, and let's get into building this. Alright, so we're starting out with just a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood. I did a drawing in SketchUp, and it took me a while of kind of working and reworking, but I think it's going to be alright. Now the drawing that I have here, the actual size of the piece I need is 68 by 44.5, and it's got these kind of interlocking fingers. The idea is that we're going to cut it out of one piece of material, and then it should be able to pull apart and slide back together. The idea being that the kerf of the blade should be enough, give me enough clearance between the pieces, and then there's going to be some steel that we're going to put underneath it. So let's lay out this drawing on the sheet of plywood and see how it goes. So in order to lay this out, I just took a tape measure and I marked always from one side of the board. Now my drawing that you'll be able to download will have all the dimensions that you'll need to lay out these tenons. You are going to want to take some care when you lay this out, because while the tenons are kind of going to self-correct, you definitely want to do your best to line everything up and make everything even. It'll just, kind of make for good practice, and it'll also help the support on the actual mattress be equal throughout the entire thing. I'm using a drywall square here, my tape measure, and that's enough to get accurate measurements, and then I'm using a washer to lay out some rounded corners. Okay, so I took my drawing, I drew it out, and I didn't really feel like rounding all the corners in my sketch, but I rounded them on this. I made sure to erase the lines that I didn't want to use. So now we'll go ahead and take the track saw, cut this up, and see how it comes out, see how it meshes once we get it done. So I'm using my Makita Track Saw here, and a track saw is a really, really great way to do this type of work because you can reliably cut perfectly straight on really any material without having to do any special jigging. So by cutting all those tenons with the track saw, I had perfectly straight cuts for the fingers, and then I used my jigsaw to cut around these other ends. Like I said, I used the washer to mark out these curves, and I'm just trying to be careful here, cutting around those corners to make sure that everything lines up really well. The big thing here is I don't want any sort of kind of dog bone. I don't want to make a shape that fits together but doesn't slide. So it's very important when you cut these to cut them accurately and not make anything that isn't going to slide back and forth easily. We are going to wind up having to sort of tune this a little bit with a sander, but for the most part, if you cut all these things square, the pieces should slide and interlock just like you see here in the video, and it should be pretty easy to tune them up so that they slide really, really well. So you can get the general idea of what I'm trying to do here, but these are a little wide at the end, so they're kind of binding, so I'm just going to go back with the jigsaw, try to clean these up, maybe hit them with the sander, and this should just sort of help these pieces slide in and out of each other. So by giving a little bit of kind of touch off to these corners with the jigsaw, I'm able to get rid of any sort of overhangs that are going to stop these from sliding really well. I also, after the fact, go back with some paste wax and I wax the insides of those just to make sure that they slide nicely. Now I'm going to start cutting up the steel. I'm using my little portable bandsaw, but you could easily use a hacksaw or an angle grinder to do this. This is thin wall material, so it's very easy to cut it up with the bandsaw, and it would be easy to cut it up with a grinder, or any real way to cut metal is not going to be too difficult with this small material. Now I'm going to be using 3 pieces of this, and they need to span the wood pretty exactly because this is going to fit inside the van. So the way that you're going to attach this to the plywood is using self-tapping screws. And here I'm using 1 1/4" self-tapping screws, which will go through the 3/4 inch plywood and into the steel. Now self-tapping screws can drill into thin sheet metal, but when I'm going for accuracy, I always like to drill a little pilot hole just so that the self-tapping screw doesn't have to force its way through the metal completely and rely on that little tip. You're going to line up the screws with the edge of the tenon on both of the pieces, and you're going to need 1 extra piece of steel towards the back. And what that's going to allow you to do is it's going to allow you to have support steel at the front, the back, and the middle when everything is completely pulled out. And you'll see that in a second. So the steel that interacts in the center there is the front piece and the piece that we put on the back of the top section. So when they pull together, they meet in the middle. So you've got enough pieces of steel here that everything kind of stops itself exactly where it needs to go. All right, so now that this proof of concept works, I'm going to go over into the van and I'm going to throw some 2" by 1/8" thick angle iron on the plywood panels that I already have up, and we'll throw it in there and see how it works. I know I'm going to have to take it apart and adjust down some of these end tabs. They're just a little big and it kind of binds up a little bit, but otherwise I think it's actually pretty good. And I'm not sure if this is going to be enough, you know, like support for the mattress, but I brought it with me to the shop, so we'll see how it goes. But overall it seems all right. Now this 2x2 angle is really strong stuff, but it's also very light, which is awesome. You can also purchase it like the Home Center. Home Depot sells it, and you're going to need a piece that's long enough to support the entire bed frame. Now what I'm doing here is I'm just drilling some 3/16 holes in it using just a regular drill bit, and then I'm going to screw these into the plywood panels that are on the side walls of my van. On the sliding door side, I'm going to need to offset the angle iron just a little bit because my Sprinter has an automatic closing door, and there's a little bit of a bump out for where the motor is, and I'm going to need to compensate for that. Now these rails need to be the exact same height off the floor, so I'm just using some plywood blocks to get me up off the ground. And again, I'm using self-tapping screws to make sure that if I hit any of the sheet metal bracing behind the plywood, I zip right through that. And now I'm just making some marks with my little guides screwing this piece of plywood to the wall, and then I'm going to screw my piece of steel to that plywood, and that's going to give me the offset that I need to get around that bump out in the door. Now, I made these side panels for my van. They're made out of 3/4 inch wood. Like I said, I just painted them gray. I did a whole video insulating and doing this sort of interior van build out to prepare for stuff like this. And you can check out the link to that video in the description if you want to check it out and kind of see this series from the beginning. Now, at this point, I still had my passenger seats in the vehicle, and it made it really difficult to get this thing installed. I had to take it apart, but in the future, if you don't have your passenger seats in, it's very easy to slide this thing into the van and onto the steel without really too much effort. So you can see me putting that steel back in and then kind of putting those self-tapping screws in just to sort of register everything and see how it's going to work out. One of the important things here is that you need to secure the edge of the bed frame to the sidewall in some way, otherwise that pulling motion will pull the bed frame with it. I had to cut 2 small notches in the corner to get around my back pillars near my rear doors, and then I could actually give this thing a full sort of test fit and see how it works. In the end, I'm going to be putting a self-tapping screw in all the tenons so that I have really good support across this whole thing, but right now I'm just using a couple so that I can test it and make sure that it's going to fit properly. You want to make sure you get this thing as close to the rear door as you possibly can, which would avoid any sort of gaps between the edge of the mattress and the doors. And it is going to need a couple of legs, so I'm just sort of temping those out with some 2x4s now and sort of seeing how the platform feels to get an idea whether or not it's going to work. Now when I take this thing out, I make sure to mark the steel, and I undo a bunch of my self-tapping screws, and I have to take this thing out again in sections. In sections, it's super lightweight and easy to move, but once you put that steel in there, it locks the pieces together, so you have to unscrew from the steel if you do want to take it apart. Before I go any further, I want to paint and prep these 2x1/8 inch pieces of angle. I cut little miters on the corners just so that you don't hit yourself on a sharp corner, and I use a prepping disc from Faird to sort of grind off some of that residual rust and mill scale, and then I'm going to paint them a flat black so that they won't rust and they'll just sort of disappear in the van. I'm using a Rust-Oleum flat black paint. I like to use flat black because whatever chemicals they put to kind of make that flat color will make the paint dry really quickly. You'll notice if you paint something glossy versus flat, the flat will always dry faster. Had to do a little more tuning on those tenons, so I decided to use my little portable belt sander, and I just want to make sure that I have a nice smooth round corner. The cut from the circular saw is very, very smooth, but the cut from the jigsaw is not. So I want to make sure that I grind out any of those heavy saw marks and make sure that everything's going to interlock and slide really, really well. Now I can align my pieces of steel. So each of the 2 sections gets 2 pieces of steel. And I want to make sure that I'm using the same pieces that I did for the test, and I'm able to line them up and make sure that everything fits right before I start drilling and putting in my self-tapping screws. Now, it's probably possible to do this with wood instead of steel, but the thing about using the steel is that you get a lot better strength to weight ratio. I'm not trying to add a tremendous amount of bracing or supports to this, and I really want it to work and be easy to move in and out of the van. If you were to make this out of wood, you'd probably need to use some pretty thick material for bracing, and it would make the whole thing very heavy. You can see a little proof of concept there, kind of working through it and making sure that I'm not warping the position of those tenons as I'm screwing them in. If you're going to build something like this, you want to make sure that everything stays nice and square, because if you knock one of those tenons out of square, it could easily bind up when you're pulling the bed from the couch mode to bed mode. Now I'm going to want to fabricate some steel legs for this. So my thought on the steel legs is that I definitely want to have one in the rear at all times, and then I want to have one in the middle and one in the front when it's out in bed mode. So I take a little piece of angle iron and I drill a couple of holes in it so that I can cut it up and attach it to some more 1x1 steel that we're going to use for legs. Now I'm going to be welding these on to the 1x1, but you could easily do it with zip screws, and you could use little angle brackets that you could get from like the hardware store or Home Depot to accomplish the exact same task. It might just take a little bit more time and a little bit more care. I grind and prep all these just to make sure there aren't any majorly sharp corners, and I'm able to weld them up. So these are plastic caps. I get these from McMaster, and I got two different sizes. These are for 10 to 14 gauge material, and these are for 14 gauge to 20 gauge material. So this is some 16 gauge wall, and presses on nice. It's just a hard plastic. And these are 1/8 wall, and this will also press on a little more energy. And these will just keep the floor of the van from getting scratched up. Nice finished little look, and I don't have to weld a cap on that end. So like I said before, you could very easily do this without the welder. If you are thinking about getting into welding, I have a link in my bio to the Lincoln MP140, which is a great intro to welding, kind of beginner welder, or even just, you know, for an experienced fabricator, because it does MIG, TIG, and stick. But the way that you would do this without welding is you would get some angle brackets from, say, the hardware store, from Home Depot, and then you could use either some self-tapping screws, or you could use some long bolts to bolt straight through the legs, and that would be plenty strong to hold these in place. The welding sort of just makes it a little bit faster, and since I have access to the machine, it's just a little bit easier. Now, in order to attach these to the bottom of the bed frame itself, we're going to be drilling and tapping some 1/4-20 holes. This is also super easy, and you know, it might be intimidating to some, but you can see it's very simple. You drill the appropriate size hole, and then you just run a tap through it. You can even use a drill because the thin wall material is really, really easy to tap. And then I'm just putting in some cap head stainless steel screws, and that's going to keep those legs able to be put on and taken off really easily if I want to sort of flat pack this up against the wall. It's important that when this thing isn't in the van, that it's not a burden to store. Now back out at the van, I've got my friend Lewis here with me, and he's going to help me get the platform in. But before I do that, I have to put the angle iron back against the sidewalls. I had left some little witness marks there just to make sure I put them in the same position. And I also brought out those spacers that I used earlier to make sure that they're at the correct height. It's really important that these are level, otherwise they're going to sit uneven, and I want to make sure that I give enough clearance so that the bed can go all the way out to the front. Now, the bed platform was really difficult to get in while the passenger seats were in, but now that they're out, it's pretty easy to sort of tilt it on its side and sneak it in onto those rails. Lewis helps me get the alignment right because I want to make sure that that front piece of steel doesn't fall off the front of the angle iron. Once it's set up, I go ahead and I reattach the legs to the bottom using the Allen key screws that I had used inside. And I also put some felt pads on the bottom of these so that when the sections were sliding apart, they wouldn't scratch up the floor of the van, and they would also move a little bit easier. The next thing that I had to do was just secure it to the back section of the van near the rear doors, just using some longer screws, and that'll just keep the whole thing from moving when I'm sliding it in and out. The last thing was to bring in the mattress and just sort of see how everything fit. This little 3-fold mattress works out awesome. It's super comfortable, works great as a couch, and easily pulls out into a bed. All right, that about does it for this video. I'm really happy with the way this thing came out. One of the things I was concerned with was if those slats were going to provide enough support when you were resting on it, because there is such a big gap between the slats themselves and the steel bars in the bottom. We took this on a trip to Michigan. It worked out great. Super comfortable mattress, and the mattress topper just made it that much better. Plenty of room to move around for 2 people because it's a queen size mattress. If you have any questions about this, please leave them down below in the comments. I also did a video where I insulated this van and put in this exhaust fan, and you should check that out. There'll be a link down below for that as well. I'm going to be preparing this van for some kind of weekender trips. And I know a lot of guys in my position that are makers or carpenters that have sprinters want to have an easy way to set it up so they can go camping on the weekends. My goal is to build stuff that's modular, that can come in and out of the van super easily so that I can use it to haul around tools and equipment, but also quickly convert it for a little weekend trip, or even to go away for a longer period of time, because, you know, on this type of setup, you can sleep on this for a while. The exhaust fan makes it way, way more comfortable than it normally would be with just all the windows closed. The drawings for this are also going to be on my website. I'll throw a link to that below as well. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this and more videos in the shop building stuff. Links to everything that I used are going to be in the description also. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you on the next one.